Janus Forum conversation on the causes of poverty, sponsored by the Political Theory Institute. I'm Tom Merrill. I'm an associate professor of government in the School of Public Affairs and the associate director of the Political Theory Institute here at American University. Before we get started, I want to announce that PTI has several more events coming up this term, including another Janus Forum 1 month from today, March 1st. That event will be entitled, Can Capitalism Be Fixed? And will feature two young policy intellectuals, Rehan Salam of National Review and Bhaskar Sankara of the Jacobin magazine. If you're interested in that or in other PTI events this term, please do check out our webpage, which is on the School of Public Affairs website. I'm going to leave the introductions of our distinguished guests to our moderator tonight, except I'll just say thank you very much for coming. But I would like to say something about the Janus Forum and the Political Theory Institute before we begin. We at PTI established the Janus Forum because we thought there was a need on campus for an empirically grounded, normatively aware discussion of the great issues of our time. Some people asked us at the time, what does political theory have to do with all of these policy questions? Isn't political theory just a combination, I think this was my colleagues, isn't political theory just a combination of highfalutin moralizing on the one hand and the antiquarian study of old, really old books on the other? We at PTI see it differently. We think that if you push hard enough on any serious practical controversy, you'll find some normative disagreement about justice or the good society. Political theory, on our view, is not something that gets applied to politics from the outside because it's already inside of politics. It's the whole reason that we care about, get passionate about, want to talk about, and argue about politics. If this is right, we can't avoid trying to understand the normative opinions already present in political life right in front of us. In, for example, the political controversies of our time and place. And for that, to understand the normative opinions that we already have, we need alternatives. We need debates, discussions, differences of opinion, if only so that we can know more clearly and own more honestly the reasons for our own opinions. It goes without saying that for this task, we need the freedom of speech. We need to hear the serious alternatives, even the ones that are not popular in our time and place, which includes some very old books. And we need to be able to say out loud our own opinions, whatever that opinion might be. But it also goes without saying that the function of free speech is not defined by the troll who posts nasty things on anonymous websites. Rather, our need for free speech is rooted in a public-spirited concern for the health of society, our society, and our desire to improve that society so far as we can, if only by understanding it more clearly. From this point of view, free speech is not a right to be demanded, but an ethos to be lived. Just as we need free speech for ourselves, so too ought we to respect the speech of those with whom we disagree, and to show by example, and not just by word, that we're willing to listen and consider, although perhaps not to agree with what they have to say. The Janus Forum is meant to put this ethos into practice. We pick our topics because we think these are things that our community needs to be talking and thinking about. We pick our speakers because they have expertise on those topics, but also because we think that they're examples of the ethos that we're trying to embody and to encourage. Put differently, we hope that you in the audience experience tonight's conversation as an invitation to think and to study, and above all, to be part of that conversation. I need to thank a few people before we begin in earnest. Alan Levine, my colleague in the Department of Government and the founding director of the Political Theory Institute, helped in the conception and the planning of tonight's event, and crucially, helped raise the money that makes tonight's event possible. Barbara Romzek, Dean of the School of Public Affairs, has provided invaluable support to PTI, and her staff, especially the events planning staff, is responsible for the logistics of the event tonight. We really are in their debt, so thanks very much. And yeah, so those are the people who actually did all the work. And finally, I want to say a special thank you to Bradley Hardy, our colleague and friend, professor in the Department of Public Administration and Policy, and the moderator for tonight's event. Brad conceived and did almost all of the organizational work for our program, so this is really his show. We at PTI are very grateful to him for his hard work and very happy indeed to partner in this way to make the event possible. Many, many thanks to him. So. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brad. Thanks very much.
Tom, thanks for the great charge for the Janus Forum conversation. And just frankly, to our outside guests, welcome to American University and welcome to this conversation. We're just super pleased to have Sandy Darity and Belle Sawhill visiting on a topic of great importance. Issues surrounding poverty and inequality really run through a range of areas in American society. Whether you're directly concerned about poverty and inequality or not, chances are this is a topic of great concern for you. Whether it's politics and thinking about an electorate that's uneasy with their economic station and in wages that have been flat since, by some measures, since the 2000s. It has an effect in that political space, health, access to quality health care and health equity, issues of education and educational access, traditional versus new modes of providing K through 12 education. Many of our students at AU will go on to work for institutions like Teach for America that place students in some of the nation's highest poverty counties and school systems. Law enforcement and justice issues, even in nearby Baltimore, Maryland, with an underlying undercurrent of poverty there, and even issues having to do with environmental policy and water quality. Poverty's all around us, and the impacts are pretty clear. About 15% of our citizens are poor by the official government definition, and so our speakers are going to try to introduce you to some of the recent research, some of their own research and findings having to do with racial wealth gaps, having to do with the intergenerational transmission of economic status, the degree to which your parents' background does or doesn't predict where you land as an adult. They're going to talk about those sorts of mechanisms, perhaps even offer some solutions. I want to tell you a little bit about the format. Each speaker is going to provide their own prepared remarks, and then each will have the chance to respond to one another. At that point, the three of us will have a discussion, and I have some questions in mind, and they might even have some questions for one another. And then after that's all wrapped up, it's going to be really great to open it up to the audience, and you all can ask some questions as well. So, with that, I'm asking that you hold your questions until that portion of our event towards the end, and I'll let you know when that is. So thank you for that. And so, now for me to introduce two very esteemed scholars in policy and inequality and poverty. These are short introductions. Really, they've got very long CVs, both of them. So, first off, William Sandy Darity Jr. is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, and Economics at Duke University. He's also the director of the Cook Center on Social Equity. His research is expansive, but includes work on inequality across race, class, and ethnicity, the study of stratification economics, schooling and racial achievement gaps, north-south theories of trade and development. He looks at reparations. He looks at the Atlantic slave trade and the Industrial Revolution. And he looks at contemporary issues regarding social psychological effects of exposure to unemployment. So pretty timely topics. And among a range of accolades and achievements, he has served as a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. He's been a fellow at the National Humanities Center, and he's been a visitor at the Federal Reserve Board. Sandy received the Westerfield Award in 2012 from the National Economic Association. It's the NEA's highest honor, and he's also served as a past president of both the National Economic Association and the Southern Economic Association. He's published extensively, editing 12 books, and he's published over 200 professional articles and journals. Sandy holds a PhD from MIT. And now for Belle Sawhill. Isabel Sawhill is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. At Brookings, she previously served as vice president and director of the economic studies program and as co-director of the Center for Children and Families. She served as a visiting professor at Georgetown Law and director of the National Commission for Employment Policy. Her research is also quite extensive and expansive and looks at issues surrounding economics and social policy, including fiscal policies, economic growth on a national level, poverty and inequality. She's thought hard about welfare reform topics. That's the cash assistance for poor Americans and the reform of that program in 1996. Issues surrounding child well-being and the issues surrounding family structure and how that relates to issues of poverty. Among her range of accolades and achievements, she's the Francis Perkins Fellow of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. She's received the Academy's Moynihan Award. She's also served as a past president of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management. For some of us in this room, that's APAM. And she's a 2014 recipient of APAM's Exemplar Award. Previously an associate director at the Office of Management and Budget, and her responsibilities were looking at all human service programs, which took up a third of the federal budget. Bill Sawhill holds her PhD from NYU. So those are the introductions, and again, we're just thrilled to have both of you here at American University. Again, the format's going to be that Sandy will start off by giving his remarks, and then Belle will follow up with her remarks, and then we'll have an exchange from there. So, thank you all.
I'm much shorter than Bradley. So, thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's probably my second visit to American University, and the previous one occurred approximately 30 years ago. So that's just an indicator of my own age. I'd like to begin by talking about the significance of wealth and the distinction between wealth and income. So income, in the way in which economists are accustomed to thinking about it, is a flow of resources, in contrast with wealth, which is a stock of resources. And we think of wealth as the difference between the value of the assets that we possess and the indebtedness that we incur, or the difference between what we own and what we owe. And I want to argue that wealth is a significant and perhaps the primary indicator of economic well-being for individuals, for families, and for households. In fact, I want to propose that it's the paramount indicator of social well-being. So wealthier families are better positioned to finance elite independent school and college education. They have greater access to the capital that would enable them to start a business, to finance expensive medical procedures, to reside in higher amenity neighborhoods, to incur lower health hazards, to address learning disabilities in their family's children, to exert political influence, particularly in our plutocracy, through campaign financing, to purchase better counsel if confronted with the legal system, to have a greater capacity to leave a bequest, and or to withstand financial hardship resulting from any number of emergencies, including job loss or health crises. Now, in general, wealth can offset the adverse effects of income volatility. The perfect storm of adverse effects for any family is created by low income, high income volatility, and low wealth. And Bradley Hardy's own work on income volatility is vital to understanding the impact of unstable and unpredictable incomes on family welfare. And that welfare is definitely supported or maintained more easily if the family has a high net worth position. Now, the standard concepts of poverty are either the use of a notion of income poverty or human poverty. The concept of income poverty is fairly straightforward. It's contingent upon establishing some sort of line of demarcation between the income that individuals or families or households possess that put them into the category of non-poor versus putting them in the category of poor. Historically, in the United States, I think we have, I'd like to call that line of demarcation the Orshansky line, because the person who initially developed a widely used federal formal criteria for identifying poverty was a woman named Molly Orshansky, and that criteria has been modified somewhat. There have been other alternatives that have been developed, but it remains at the core of the way in which we think about establishing the poverty rate in America. The human poverty concept was developed at the United Nations Development Program in response in part to the philosophical issues that the economist Amartya Sen raised about the limitations of income, per capita income, or economic growth measured on the basis of variations in income as a basis for trying to assess human well-being. And so Sen proposed that we would be better off if we used a richer concept that he described as one that incorporates functionings and capabilities of human beings. And that led the United Nations Development Program to develop the Human Poverty Index. And the Human Poverty Index for high-income countries in particular includes the following components. So there's a longevity component, the probability at birth of not surviving to age 60. There's a knowledge component, the proportion of adults lacking functional literacy skills. There's a decent standard of living component, the population below the income poverty line, and in this particular case, the measure that's used in the UNDP's Human Poverty Index is 50% of median adjusted household disposable income. And then finally, there's a social exclusion component, the rate of long-term unemployment lasting 12 months or more. Now you'll notice that both for the income poverty measure and the human poverty measure, wealth does not appear as a component of either of them. So I'd like to propose an alternative concept of poverty to both the income poverty and human poverty measures, and this is the notion of asset poverty. Since net worth is the value of assets minus the value of debts, asset poverty becomes a primary danger for most Americans. You're unlikely to accumulate significant debt if you're well endowed with assets. And indeed, for the wealthiest Americans, huge debt is not necessarily a liability. Here's the famous maxim: if you owe the bank enough, you own the bank. And you know, one of the foremost examples of this is an individual who is now running for president of the United States, Donald Trump. Negative net worth with a high asset position is not necessarily a negative position. So I would propose that we need to develop a measure of asset poverty, and I will suggest a route toward that during the course of my presentation this evening. I'd also like to add that intergenerational well-being is captured best by wealth. This is both private and community wealth, although my conversation this evening is going to focus on private wealth. This would provide us with a strong notion of the capacity of families or households to transfer or to transmit a secure economic status to the next generation. Now, there are two conceptions of the decisive factor in asset accumulation, and I'd like to juxtapose these. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but I think that they are typically framed as opposite ends of the coin. So I'd like to distinguish between savings behavior as the source of asset accumulation versus intergenerational transfers as the source of asset accumulation. And by intergenerational transfers, I'm referring to inheritance and gifts, or in the parlance of economists, in vivo transfers. Okay. And in vivo transfer simply refers to transfers of resources that occur while the donor is still living. So I'd also like to add that it's not just the amount of resources that get transferred, but it is the timing that is a critical factor in terms of providing a more secure outcome for the subsequent generation. So if we focus on savings behavior as the decisive way in which asset accumulation takes place, it leads to the expectation that educational attainment can drive wealth accumulation. Here's the notion. Higher levels of education are associated with higher levels of human capital. This leads to a greater capacity to earn higher levels of wages, and hence have higher levels of income. And if individuals are saving out of those higher levels of income, they will have a greater degree of asset accumulation. The alternative perspective, however, is that the primary source of asset accumulation are transfers that individuals receive from the previous generation. If that's the case, we're then talking about asset accumulation as something that is driven by non-merit behavior, okay? And if we take that latter view, it weakens the connection between educational attainment and wealth accumulation. I'm going to argue that the latter view is the one that I have greater sympathy for, and it's strongly connected to a particular approach in economics that I'm engaged in that are referred to as stratification economics. Further preliminary observation. Increasing attention to inequality is something that is occurring at the present moment. I'm not sure how long this moment will last, but it's actually fairly remarkable, the degree of discussion that's taking place at the present time about the problem of inequality. Much of that discussion suffers from two limitations. The major studies tend to examine disparity in income, but not wealth. And even worse, major studies like Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century do not examine intergroup inequality, whether it's based upon race, ethnicity, gender, caste, or religious affiliation. Intergroup inequality of wealth is gaining more attention due to work by the Pew Institute and by some of the work that I've been doing with Derek Hamilton that I'm going to talk about in greater detail with what we call the NASC project. But it is not present in many, many studies that have a high degree of visibility. I'm thinking of not only Piketty's work, but the work of Emmanuel Saez, of Raj Chetty, where Chetty places a strong emphasis on space as opposed to wealth, or location as opposed to wealth, and I think that that emphasis is somewhat problematic. So intergroup inequality definitely matters. Group-based inequality may set the floor on overall or general inequality in a society. So my colleague Ashwini Deshpande calls group-based inequality as perhaps the sticky floor on the degree of overall inequality that exists in a community. Moreover, group-based inequality may play a role in driving overall or general inequality. And this particular relationship is relevant to both income and wealth inequality. And the final major issue that I want to discuss at the outset is the question of the narratives that we use to explain group-based inequality. In the education literature, there's a tendency to distinguish between deficit views and resiliency views of how people behave and interact. So one way that this could be applied to our thinking about wealth accumulation is if we treat wealth accumulation as being driven by savings behavior and argue that the spending behavior of the poor is responsible for their asset poverty. Okay, so people buy too much bling, they overconsume and the like. I've always been kind of intrigued by that because the implication is that the poor should be ascetics and never have any fun. Okay, but I think that's a crazy perspective. But nevertheless, that seems to be the implication. Related to that is the view that the poor are bad money managers. and that we could improve their wealth outcomes by giving them more financial literacy, okay? I want to argue that, in fact, the poor are remarkable money managers given their limited resources. They do save, but they save primarily due to a precautionary motive to compensate for unexpected drops in income. That is to say, they don't know precisely when those drops in income will occur. So they, in a sense, they do expect them to occur, but they don't know what the timing will be. And they do know that they will happen. And so they do engage in savings for the purposes of trying to protect or insulate themselves from the effects of these unpredictable drops in income. So their behavior is not deficient. Actually, they're displaying remarkable resilience in coping with low and unstable incomes. And I think a similar kind of story applies even more emphatically to racial wealth inequality with respect to black-white differences in wealth. That is to say, Gittleman and Wolf's study in 2004, and we're in the process of trying to replicate that study with more recent data, demonstrates that if you control for household income, blacks have a similar savings rate to whites and earn a similar rate of return on their portfolios. Okay, now this is if you control for household income. And indeed, in some categories of household income, the black savings rate is actually higher than the white savings rate. So now I'd like to share some information about the work that we've been doing on the NASC project. And I will talk about that in greater detail in a moment. So the NASC project stands for the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color. And Derek Hamilton and I are the primary investigators. We benefit heavily from the funders that are listed above here, especially the Ford Foundation, and our program officer, our initial program officer who supported our efforts was Kilolo Kijikazi, who is now at the Urban Institute, and Amy Brown, who has been our most recent program officer. And we have a variety of research partners. On one of our projects that focuses on racial and ethnic wealth inequality in Boston, we've partnered with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. We have a new report that's going to be coming out on Los Angeles, which will be in partnership with the Federal Reserve Board of San Francisco, and one on Washington, D.C., which will be in partnership with the Federal Reserve Board of Richmond. So the Board of Governors, which is based in the city, is actually not the supervising board for the city of Washington, D.C. It's actually the Federal Reserve of Richmond. Okay. And this is a list of the array of scholars who have worked on this project with us. This list is growing. We're hoping to include Bradley Hardy on this list in the near future. But you can see that we have a pretty remarkable team that's permitted us to examine and explore a wide set of dimensions of our project, and I'll talk about how wide that is in a moment. Okay. So let me start with national data rather than the data from the NASC survey. This is from the Survey of Income and Program Participation, and it gives us a sense of how median net worth has altered or changed over the course of the Great Recession based upon race and ethnicity. And one of the things that's most striking is the somewhat surprising finding of the dramatic decline, perhaps the most dramatic decline, in the relative wealth position of Asian Americans in comparison with white Americans. This is the most dramatic decline, particularly between 2005 and 2009. So obviously, there were significant declines for blacks and Latinos, but of course, they started with so much less that the decline doesn't have as sharp a character as it has for Asians. So if you look at the bottom part of the table, you'll see that between 2005 and 2011, blacks go from having 9 cents per every $1 held by whites at the median to having 6 cents per every dollar held by whites at the median. Latinos go from having 14 cents at the median per every dollar that's held by whites to 7 cents. But then you'll look at Asians, and initially in the interval between 2005 and 2009, they actually go from having $1.24 per dollar held by whites at the median. That is to say, Asians actually had a higher level of wealth in 2005, to having 68 cents in 2009, and some recovery up to 83 cents in 2011. This is a huge decline, and we speculate that it may be because the Asian American population in the United States is disproportionately located in those areas of the country that took the biggest hits in terms of home equity losses. Okay. Well, okay, so some people have argued, well, really what you're doing when you're looking at racial wealth gaps is you're tracking income gaps. Not so. Okay. So the racial wealth gap is substantial in each of the quintiles of income, as displayed here. And the differential or the gap gets wider the lower the level of income. So that if you go to the lowest quintile, you'll see that the white median in the lowest quintile is about $15,000, and it's actually $100. There are actually some ways of looking at the estimates that would suggest that it was $0 for blacks in the lowest income category. Okay. Even when you get to the highest income category, you can see that there's a sharp differential in the net worth position between blacks and whites, where the red column is indicative of white net worth, and the blue column is indicative of black net worth. So we can't explain the patterns in the gaps in racial wealth on the basis of income. Nor can we explain it on the basis of patterns of employment. Okay. So you can see here, and I think this is pretty striking, although the next panel is going to be the most striking one, is that unemployed whites actually have a higher median net worth than blacks who are working full time. Okay. Okay. Here's the one that's the killer. Okay. Whites who dropped out of high school have greater wealth than blacks with a college degree. And it's not a trivial difference. Blacks with a college degree have $23,400 in median net worth, and whites with less than a high school degree have $34,700 in median net worth. So blacks with a college degree have about 2/3 of the net worth of whites who have never finished high school. Well, we also might be concerned about what we call liquid assets. What are liquid assets? Liquid assets are assets that can be converted rapidly into usable cash. So, we don't think of a home as being a liquid asset, because the process of actually converting that into usable cash requires you to put the home on the market, to prepare it for sale, and to convince somebody to buy it. In contrast, savings accounts or checking accounts are liquid assets. That is to say, they are forms in which accumulated wealth can be converted rapidly into cash, so especially savings accounts. And so what we show here is that if we look at median liquid wealth holdings as of 2011, whites have a median level of $23,000, and blacks only have $3,000. Blacks only have $200, excuse me. If we look at liquid assets where we eliminate or exclude retirement resources, then white liquid assets drop to $3,000, and black liquid assets drop to $25. Okay? If you think about these ratios, they're staggering and very indicative of the greater vulnerability of some of our communities of color to any kind of emergency circumstances. They're not going to be able to cover this. We could also think about this in a slightly different way, about the implications of what kinds of resources you have access to that would permit you to cover 3 or 4 months of lost income in the event of joblessness. And here you can see that if we look at whites, liquid wealth, including retirement, it becomes possible to cover 2, 3, or 4 months if somebody had a median income of $40,000 to $45,000 directly out of their liquid wealth. That's an impossibility for blacks on average. Okay. So here's some lessons that we learned in the aftermath of the Great Recession. First, black and Latino families have few liquid assets to take risks or deal with financial emergencies or shocks. Second, everybody lost during the Great Recession. They lost net worth, but the communities of color suffered the most. The racial wealth gap was extreme before the recession, and it worsened after. And third, Asians suffered the largest absolute loss in home values and wealth, and in the interval between 2005 and 2009 suffered the largest relative loss. And I've talked about that a bit earlier. So the narrative that we're able to extract from the national data is incomplete. And here's the reasons. Asset markets are local. For example, there's a geographic maldistributive effects of the housing crisis. Second, the wealth position of many communities of color remains unknown in the national data. So aggregate categories like Asian or Hispanic or even black mask the asset position for certain specific national origin groups, like those immigrating from Southeast Asia. We're not able to distinguish by looking at the category Hispanic between Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Cubans, and the like. And among blacks, we aren't able to separate out in the standard data blacks who are descendants of folks who were enslaved in the United States versus blacks who were more recent immigrants from the Caribbean or from the African continent. And further, indigenous groups, Native Americans, are often hidden altogether in the nebulous catch-all category of other. So this led us to be motivated to develop the National Asset Scorecard for Communities of Color. Essentially a demonstration project to compare specific groups within urban contexts to first provide implicit controls for asset and debt pricing and products that are geographically local. Second, analyze the wealth of groups that are hidden in the broadly defined non-white categories. Third, examine asset and debt attributes particular to communities of color. And fourth, provide a template for a more permanent data collection infrastructure. And I must add that we actually have the capacity to disaggregate the so-called white population as well on the basis of ethnic origin. We haven't explored this yet, but we asked all of our respondents for a response to an ancestry question. Okay. So we constructed this survey by making use of the panel study of income dynamics, asset and debt module. We made use of the multi-city study of urban inequalities questionnaire for other dimensions, and we had some supplemental questions. And in our next round, for the next city that we pursue, we're going to have more detailed questions about income volatility. So one of the problems we have is that some of these specific ancestral origin groups are hard to find. That is not so much that they're hard to find in a visual sense, but they're hard to locate, to include in a survey. And we used a phone survey for all of these purposes, and you can see that the number of completions that we ultimately got is actually fairly low relative to the amount of time that was devoted to the survey administration. In fact, our estimate is that we got 0.2 completions per hour. So this made the survey quite expensive, but it resulted in a sample across the cities. There are 5 cities that we conducted the survey in of over 2,700 responses. Okay. We use survey weights that are anchored on the American Community Survey data to establish the representativeness of the responses. However, our unweighted results are fairly similar to the weighted results. Okay. So our criteria for selecting metropolitan areas was primarily the identification of the cities that would provide us with a basis for looking at the specific national origin groups. And so the outcome was the selection of Los Angeles, Miami, Tulsa, and the District of Columbia. We later added Boston because of the interest that the Federal Reserve Board of Boston had in conducting a parallel study. Okay. So here's the data on the distribution of responses by ancestral origin. Okay. And so you can see that we actually have the capacity to examine separately, for example, blacks of Caribbean ancestry from the African continent. And then the Boston sample, we actually had a small number of individuals who are specifically from Cape Verde, which is an island off the coast of Africa. And in fact, it's kind of funny. In our initial report on Boston, I'm glad I caught this, one of the co-authors wasn't aware of precisely where Cape Verde was located, and described it as an island in the Caribbean. And yeah, well, fortunately we caught it and corrected it. Then also there's you can see that there's a variety of groups that we have been able to separate out from the Latino or Hispanic category, and similarly for the Asian category. And then in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we actually have a significant or substantial number of responses from Native Americans, and we can distinguish between individuals who have formal or official tribal enrollment and those who do not. Okay. One of the things we looked at was payday lending patterns across these cities, predatory lending, payday lending, and one of the things that we found was that there was a close correspondence between the degree of regulation that's exercised in a particular state and the frequency with which people rely upon payday lending. Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma, has probably the fewest restrictions or controls on payday lending, and you can see that across all the groups, Tulsa is the place where there's the highest reliance upon payday lending. And so here's some information about the demographic characteristics of the city of Tulsa. And you can see in the lower portion of the block the breakdown of the Native American population. So we can distinguish between the Cherokee and the Creek, and we can distinguish between all of those three groups that have tribal enrollment status versus those that do not. We looked at asset ownership in each of the cities. Here is a table that provides information about the city of Los Angeles, the proportion of individuals from each of the groups that relies on payday lending, who's banked, who is unbanked, the access to retirement asset, patterns of home ownership, and patterns of business ownership or self-employment across the various groups. We also could look at the median value of household wealth in each of the cities. Now this is a very interesting comparison. One of the most dramatic examples to draw upon is to look at the city of Boston, which is the third column over. And you can see that U.S. black descendants had a median net worth in Boston of $8. Not 80, not 800, but 8. Okay. And this contrasts quite sharply with whites in the city of Boston, whose median net worth was in excess of $250,000. You can see that the other groups that we have been able to sort out or sort out or identify in the Boston context actually have relatively low levels of net worth, and Dominicans actually had a median net worth of $0. Okay. So here are the lessons across the 5 cities. There's actually variation within the broadly defined ethnic categories. That is to say, Dominicans look different from Cubans and so forth. Second, income inequality pales in comparison to wealth inequality. Third, an ethnic group's relative asset position may vary across cities, so that recent African immigrants in Washington, D.C. look substantially different in terms of their wealth position from recent African immigrants in Los Angeles. Home ownership varies across cities and may not be the primary driver of wealth in all cases. For example, Asian Indians in Los Angeles actually have a relatively lower level of home ownership, but very high levels of net worth. And finally, substantial asset variation across and within cities takes place, but blacks and Mexicans are persistently at the bottom in all of the cities. So let me bypass that one. I will stop there. I wanted to give you a sense, though, of the dramatic degree of wealth inequality that exists based on race and ethnicity, and we can have a richer conversation about why we might think that those differences exist and what we might do about it in the conversation that follows. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, that'd be great. While we're pulling up the slides here, let me just say, okay, thank you to you, Sandy, for those great data. I mean, you really dug into this, and I can see there's going to be a lot more to come. I am going to also talk about poverty and inequality and a little bit about wealth, but not nearly as much about wealth. And I want to begin by thanking, by the way, PTI and Professors Hardy and Merrill and everybody else who's welcomed me here. And great to see all of you on this lousy night. And, you know, you're not home listening to all the pundits talk about Iowa. So I think it would be a lot more fun than some of these PowerPoints. But thank you for being here. I love, by the way, the phrase empirically grounded but normatively informed. That, to me, says it all, because if it's not normatively informed, why would we care? But if we don't know the data, then we don't have any right to have a particular opinion. So I like that construct a lot. Let me start out by just doing the basics on poverty rates in the U.S. As Sandy said, overall, or I think it was Brett that said, overall we have a poverty rate of about 15%, but it varies enormously by race and ethnicity, as you can see on this chart. You can also see that back in the 1950s and 60s, there was quite a decline. That was mostly amongst the elderly. And since that time, poverty rates have been kind of stuck. They go up and down with the business cycle, but they don't change very much otherwise. And you can sort of see in these charts the effects of the Great Recession. The poverty rate is measured based on your annual income compared to a guideline, as Sandy said. And it means that you could be poor in a particular year, especially if you lost your job, but not be persistently poor. You might be a middle-class family, one earner, the earner loses his or her job, and bingo, you suddenly don't have any income for 6, 9 months, whatever, you're poor. But you're not necessarily persistently poor. And so I want to get into that in just a minute here. Immediate causes of poverty. I'm not talking about root causes here. We have to get into that in discussion, I think. But immediate causes, lack of a job. I mean, if you're not working, you don't have any income coming into the household. Insufficient education or training obviously leads to low wages and bad jobs. Ratio of adult earners to dependents. I used to call this family structure, but I found it such a toxic phrase nowadays that I really just want to make the point that a two-parent family as opposed to a one-parent family has the potential to have twice as much income simply because there's a second earner in the family. And for better or worse, whatever you think of it, in today's economy, to achieve a middle-class lifestyle for most people, not everyone, requires that you have two earners in the labor force. If you do just three things, we've done this analysis at Brookings for a number of years now, do just three things: graduate high school, work full-time at whatever low wage you can get, and have two parents in the family, you will have very little poverty. The poverty rate for the people who do all three of those things is 2%, not 15%. Now, that doesn't mean we can say, oh, it's very simple. All you have to do is finish high school, work, and have a strong family, because there are all kinds of deeper reasons why people don't finish school or don't have a job or don't live in a family with two earners. So when you look, though, at this data, work is critical. Even, I've done simulations that show, well, suppose we bumped up the high school graduation rate, which is now about 80%. Suppose we bumped it up to 90%, doesn't move the needle very much. Suppose we changed a lot of single-parent families into two-parent families. We actually took the census data and married off some single moms to some unrelated men. We played, the dating game, so to speak, and there were a lot of them to be matched, although there was a shortage of males. This is serious. There was a shortage of males in the African-American community because so many of them are dead or in prison. So there is a problem there. But overall, we were able to simulate all these things, and what really made the big difference was work. If you're not working, you're going to be poor. So I want to then go on to this question of, is your poverty temporary or is it persistent? A lot of people are poor in a given year because something bad happens to them. They get sick, they lose their job, they have a business failure, their family breaks up. And then they need those financial reserves that Sandy's talking about. And so in his honor, I stuck in my version of the wealth gaps here. They're very similar to his, and as you can see, and as he noted, they're huge. But I think it's also important to think about the people who are poor most of their life and whose children are going to be poor, and how we deal with that more persistent type of poverty. And in this context, and related to what Tom said about the normatively informed discussion we want to have here, these are public attitudes. This is what the American public thinks about these issues. And this is surprising to me given how much attention income inequality and wealth inequality both have gotten. I mean, I can imagine at the Iowa caucuses right now, especially the people for Bernie Sanders, they're all talking about inequality, right? But the public is not so sure that that's the major issue. Now, more of them care about poverty than care about inequality, slightly more. But what they really care about is opportunity. They want people to be self-sufficient, and they want people to have a chance to get ahead, and they want them to do that on their own bottom without a lot of government support. That's just where the attitudes are. So what do we know about that? How much mobility do we actually have as a society? And this chart is a little hard to read, but let's just take the leftmost column there. Those are children who were born in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. So basically, this is close to the poverty population. So you're a child, you're born into a poor family. What are your chances of getting out of poverty by the time you're an adult? And what this is telling you is, well, you have a 24% chance of getting into the second quintile, sort of the lower middle class, if you will. You have a 10% chance of making it all the way to the top, but you have a 36% chance of being stuck right there at the bottom where you began. The column on the far right is what happens if you were born into a very advantaged family. Then you're going to be much more likely to stay advantaged as an adult. So one of the ways we like to describe this is to say, in terms of intergenerational mobility, we have quite a bit in the United States, but we have stickiness in the tails, stickiness at the bottom of the distribution and stickiness at the top. And that may be related, I want to make the linkage, to wealth inequalities. Because as Sandy has said, these wealth inequalities give you, if you have a lot of wealth, if you have a lot of assets or net worth, they give you the flexibility not only to help yourself if things go wrong, but to help your own children. That's what he called the inter vivos transfers within your own lifetime. So that's how much we have. And now let's look at this by race. So this is a shocking figure. We originally did this research in cooperation or partnership with the Pew Charitable Trust. And this is what we found when we broke the data out by race. The column on the right there is white America. And white America really comes pretty close to being the Horatio Alger Society. You have about a 20% chance, roughly, of making it to some other rung on the ladder, regardless of where you were born, where you started. That looks pretty nice. But then look at the column on the left, and look how much difficulty black Americans have getting out of poverty if they were born into poverty. Half of poor black children are going to stay in poverty when they get to be adults, is what this is telling you. So this is to show you that these things also vary geographically. This is a map from Raj Chetty at Harvard. Sandy mentioned his work as well. And as I have argued, we need to look at income. Raj Chetty looks at income as well. And he says, let's suppose you grew up in Denver versus Atlanta. You're a child. What is your probability of making it to the top of the income distribution? Well, it's twice as great in Denver as it is in Atlanta. And the color coding here is that darker colors mean less upward mobility, and the lighter colors mean more. So if you want your child to have great opportunities, you should move to the Mountain West and stay out of the South and parts of the Middle West. These are fabulous data based on IRS individual tax returns. Now, I didn't say much about income inequality so far, but I think that's because everybody knows by now that income inequality is high in the US and it has been growing for decades. And there's a debate going on now about whether if you have much more inequality, it's going to mean less social mobility, less intergenerational mobility in the future. And I believe that the two are related. I believe that the more income inequality you have, the harder it is to climb the ladder. And Bob Putnam has just written a book called Our Kids last year, which makes the same argument. Alan Kruger, who was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, has made this argument. A number of us have made this argument, but not everybody buys it. So now I want to really truncate the next part of my slides to leave time for discussion. I see Brad shaking his head enthusiastically because this gets more into the weeds. But I don't want to leave you with just, here's the problem and it's serious. I want to give you a sense that there are things we could do about it. There are ways that we could help less advantaged kids get out of poverty and climb that ladder and have a better life when they get to be adults. And so we created this model, very data-rich life cycle model at Brookings. We call it the social genome model. It's now a partnership with the Urban Institute and Child Trends, 2 other think tanks. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. We divide, we take about 6,000 kids, representative sample of US kids, born mostly in the 1980s, 1990s, and we trace how they do through their childhood and into their early adulthood. And we track them actually all the way up to when they're age 40. And our goal, our policy goal here is to see how many are going to be middle class by middle age. Middle age is 40. Sounds young to me. But, and middle class means having an income of about $68,000 a year. Now, it turns out, and this is common sense, that if you're successful early in life, if you're ready for school at age 5, if you can read and do math at age 10, if you graduate from high school at age 18, if you don't get in trouble with the law, if you don't have a teenage baby, a baby is a teenager, if you graduate from, if you graduate from college and are self-sufficient by the time you're age 30, all you 20-somethings, you're supposed to be self-sufficient by your age 30. Don't know how many of you are making it. You're going to be well on the track to being middle class by middle age. But we have all the data on all of these things, and all of those earlier markers of success are predictive of how well you will eventually do. It shouldn't be terribly surprising. And here is a comparison of children born in low-income families to children born in more advantaged families. And at every stage of childhood, the children born into the poorer families fall behind. They're not as school ready, they're not reading as well, they're not graduating from high school as much, and so forth and so on. So this is the final sort of marker of how many people are middle class by middle age. Overall, it's roughly 50%, as you'd expect for the whole population, but look at the figures for blacks and for children born in the bottom income quintile, meaning born in poverty, versus the whites and those born in the top income quintile. Big differences here. But it starts early and it accumulates over time, this march towards success. So then what can we do? So here are 5 government programs that have all been pretty rigorously evaluated and found to move the needle on all those success metrics that I showed you earlier. Being able to read, being ready for preschool, for school at age 5, etc. And so we're going to give all of our low-income children in our sample this set of 5 successful programs, different areas, different stages of life. And here's what happens. Instead of the light blue bars are the higher income kids, the dark blue are the lower income kids, but look at now the medium blue has topped up the success rates of the less advantaged kids. And this is from rigorous evaluation of these programs. Now there is an issue of whether if you scale these programs up, they would have as good effects as they do in some of the demonstration programs. But and there's a few other caveats. But basically, what this is telling you is that if we could offer lower income kids programs like these, it could make a big difference in this whole question of opportunity and mobility. Their incomes would be about $200,000 higher over their adult lives, and the cost of the programs is estimated at roughly $20,000. So this passes a cost-benefit test as well. This is what happens to racial gaps. It's against the law to target a lot of programs just on blacks and not on other groups. But you can have what my colleague Richard Reeves and I call race-conscious policy. If you target your programs on low-income kids, you will be disproportionately picking up black and other minority kids. And so you can shrink these black-white gaps in the process of doing that. And this shows you how much. It's a little complicated to read, so I don't want to take up too much time. So what do I conclude? Poverty rates are pretty high in the U.S. We didn't talk a lot about the poverty measure, Sandy told you it was initially invented by this wonderful woman named Molly Orshansky based on the cost of a basic food package. For a three-person family, let's say a mom and 2 kids, it's about $20,000 a year. So imagine trying to live in Washington, D.C. with 2 kids on $20,000 a year. And by the way, you're having to go out to work if you're a single mom. So you've got daycare expenses and travel expenses and so forth and so on. So it's a fairly stingy standard to begin with. And I've showed you about the mobility data and how it varies, not only by race, but by where you grow up. And then I've showed you that there is hope here. There are programs that have been successful. And the problem, of course, is how to get the political will to put those programs in place and pay for them. So I'll stop there so we can have more time for discussion.
Oh, thank you. So what I'd like is relatively quick responses to one another in terms of your initial reactions, and then I'll take privilege to ask 1 or 2 sort of policy-related questions, and then we can open it up to the audience. So first, Sandy, maybe your reactions to Belle's comments.
Well, I think that we're in
The same.
great deal of concert here. I was curious, though, about the phenomenon of downward mobility. And I think that your initial graph, if you look at the kids who are born into higher income families, there's some evidence that there are some who move downward.
Yep.
And I also was interested in the racial differences in patterns of downward mobility.
These are the downward mobility charts, because you're exactly right. There are racial differences in downward mobility. In other words, let me explain. In the data that we used, we had a group, not a huge group, but a substantial group of middle-class African-American parents. And so then we traced what happened to their kids as they grew up. And what Sandy, I think, is suggesting that's a little disturbing in the data is they tend to fall down the ladder. They tend to have difficulty maintaining the middle-class status of their parents. And there are lots of possible, reasons for that, but one, I think, is the one that Sandy is talking about, which is if you don't have much in the way of assets or wealth, you don't have that cushion that you need to get you through hard times. So even though your income, the black family income, might be the same as the white family income, it might be that if you looked at their wealth status, it would tell you quite a bit more.
And then Belle, likewise, any reactions or comments on Sandy's presentation?
I am very interested that Sandy thinks wealth is such a paramount indicator here. I certainly think it matters. But I'm not sure I'm quite as convinced as he is that it matters more than other measures like income, for example. And I am actually very much a fan of Amartya Sen's Human Capacities Index. And here's why. Imagine that you had a lot of wealth and you had it all invested in the stock market or in a fancy house somewhere, and suddenly the stock market collapses or your real estate market collapses and suddenly your wealth is gone. If you still have your health and your education, your human capital, if you will, you're going to be okay. So I think wealth is very, very volatile. And I think for reasons that go beyond economics, just really what we want as human beings to have a good life, that what matters most is health and education. But, you may want to react and...
Well, I guess my reaction...
Imagine Donald Trump suddenly went to 0. What would he have left? I'm sorry, I don't want to politicize this, but really...
Well, I think my view is that prior wealth position gives you access to those other things. that an individual who loses a substantial amount of net worth in a situation where there's a drop in the stock market or there's a collapse of home equity prices probably already has a greater level of health and well-being that can be maintained through the period where there is that decline. And if we think about the declines as being relative to a high level of wealth, the individual is not really going to have a complete destruction of their net worth. I was thinking in particular of the data on Asian Americans' median net worth. So there's a substantial drop, but if you look at the levels that they have after that drop, they're still quite high.
They're still doing well. You know, that was another question I had, or a puzzlement in terms of what you emphasized, and that is, I expected you to put a lot more emphasis on the past injustices that have been related to redlining and predatory lending and subprime mortgages aimed at the African American community. And that I think that, you know, we need the data, and I'm sure you have it, on how much wealth is inherited and how much is from one's own savings and from one's own home equity. And my impression, although I don't know the data as well as you do, is that for everybody except in the top 5% of the income distribution, most wealth is held in the form of home equity.
That's right.
And so the housing market seems to me to be the most important thing to look at when you're concerned about wealth for everyone except the top.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems, of course, with the housing market is that in the course of the Great Recession, we converted the housing market into a casino. And you know, traditionally, we think about housing as a fairly stable source of wealth, but it has not been as of late. But I would also argue that your capacity to gain a home, to buy a home or purchase a home, is contingent in a significant way on the wealth position of your parents. So we think about many cases where a young couple purchases a home and they get a significant amount of help with the down payment for the mortgage from their parents. So I guess, you know, what's critical to my way of thinking is I think of parental or family wealth as kind of the driver for these other opportunities. And I think that when folks emphasize the savings acts of the individual themselves, they are obscuring the importance of that previous wealth position that's held by the prior generation. In much of our empirical work on this, we actually do accounting exercises where we divvy up what the sources of wealth are. But that's really an accounting exercise that doesn't have a causal framework that would give us a sense of how significant parental wealth and resources are in creating the conditions for individuals to accumulate those different categories of wealth. So, I mean, I think, you know, there's an important empirical project about looking at the relationship between parental wealth and the wealth outcomes of the next generation. But that hasn't been fully realized.
Let me
yet.
just put a big policy question on the table here. If we're going to worry about wealth, the first thing we should really focus on, in my view, is the estate tax. I don't know how many people in this audience know. I can tell you that the broad American public does not know the facts about this. The number of people in the United States who pay any estate tax is 0.2%, less than 1%. Now, why is that? It's because our tax law is egregiously favorable to inheritances. You get a $5.4 million exemption
That's right.
for each parent. So that's over 10 million for the two together. And then the rate, the highest rate, is 40%. Back in 2001, the exemption was 675,000, just to tell you how much has changed, from 675,000 to over 5 million per person, and the top rate was 55%. I didn't think it was high enough even then. I mean, if you're a society that believes in equal opportunity, every generation should start on their own bottom.
That's right.
And we don't.
Yeah.
And the baby boom generation is the wealthiest generation we've had so far by quite a lot. And they're going to move into those ages where they're not only helping their kids buy houses, as you say, but they're going to be leaving tons of money to the next generation. And we have this paltry estate tax.
You know, Bill, I want to pivot off your comment on policy and the estate tax and ask you both one question before we open it up to the audience. And so, you know, there's a lot in this question, right? So I'm building a lot here, but you know, you have a lot of analysts and researchers who want to solve this poverty problem, who might recommend a range of education policy reforms to sort of build skills in the population so that they can perform better in the labor market. And at the same time, at the local level, we're seeing relatively bipartisan support for reforms like larger refundable earned income tax credits. So these are relatively large tax credits at tax time for the working poor that can amount to $5,000–6,000 or more. And so those are somewhat popular in a bipartisan sense. We see states that are boosting those at the local level. And then you have cities like Seattle, New York, Washington, D.C., that are putting larger minimum wages on the books. And so I guess I wonder, from a policy context, given your two strands of research, which has some agreement, what do we do? And with limited resources.
Well, I think you've touched on the really important policy areas, at least from my perspective. I think we do need to raise the minimum wage. By the way, as an economist, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, did I think we should raise the minimum wage, I would have said no. Now, I think we definitely need to raise it because it's really sunk a lot. And you, as you just said, see a lot of cities and states now going above the federal minimum. Earned income tax credit. It is a terrific program. It has, for those of you who don't know, as Bradley says, you can get as much as $5,000–6,000 in the District of Columbia. He just told me tonight, I didn't know this. You can get $7,000 or $8,000 at the end of the year if you're, let's say, a mom with a couple of kids and you're working close to full time but at a low wage. So your total take-home pay from your job is maybe $15,000, something like that. You're going to be able to top that up. You're going to be able to increase that by 50%. And the nice thing about the Earned Income Tax Credit is it encourages work, and we have good research that shows that. It also improves children's upward mobility. So, you know, nothing but good things to say about the Earned Income Tax Credit. And on education, I think we need more public school choice. When Mayor Bloomberg was mayor of New York and had a superintendent of education named Joel Klein, they closed down a lot of the large public high schools in New York, were overwhelmingly minority high schools, and set up some what they called small schools of choice. So the schools were not only smaller, had better teachers, had vocational themes, had partnerships with people in the community, but you as a family or as a parent could choose where you wanted your kid to go to school. Now, you didn't always get your first choice, but it was a lottery, and it was a choice. And they have increased high school graduation rates by 10 percentage points in New York. That is huge. I mean, this is from about 60% to about 70%. And this was all, and furthermore, it cost less than the old system. Why did it cost less? Because people were taking 5–6 years to get through high school. Now many more people are graduating in 4 years, and more of them are going on to college. It's a great story.
No, thank you for that. And Sandy, you know, your response.
So the first thing is that I think with respect to improving schooling, that we need to move in the direction of curriculum and instruction improvement. And so I would advocate that we move in the direction of providing the equivalent of gifted quality education for all students. I'm really anxious to address some questions that fall through the cracks when we think about access to quality schooling, like the fact that in many of our schools, under a regime of desegregated schools, we create internal segregation in the schools, so that kids who are from particular social groups, if they're black kids, for example, they're going to be disproportionately concentrated in the slow learner classes and underrepresented in the classes that offer a more challenging curriculum. And so I think that there needs to be, in addition to addressing the question of segregation across schools or segregation of resources across schools, we need to address segregation within schools. And so I guess that's my priority. Retraining teachers so that they're capable of providing a high level of instruction and curriculum to all students in the classroom. With respect to the provision of adequate wages and income, I think under the existing regime, EITC and minimum wage laws are the way to go. However, both for individuals to benefit from both, they have to have jobs. Okay, and so unless we address the question of whether or not we assure people of the provision of opportunities to have employment, we're not going to provide them with an assurance of benefiting from the minimum wage laws or earning the earned income tax credit. So I've been an advocate of a federal policy that I talked about with a group of the students today, which is what I've been calling a federal job guarantee. And the last thing I'll mention is that I actually, I agree wholly with your concerns about the estate tax. I recently discovered that my inherited estate from my late father was so low in value that I had no tax obligation whatsoever. I mean, I didn't come close to bumping up against the $5.4 million threshold, but then I was stunned that there was a $5.4 million threshold for you to have any tax obligation whatsoever. So I'm in agreement with you about altering the tax law, and I presume the period where the law was changed was the Reagan administration, or was it
Bush?
It was
I think
Bush. Okay.
And the Republicans are now trying to repeal it entirely.
Altogether. Yeah. So
Their
so that,
argument, by the way, just to be fair, is you're taxing people twice. You tax them once when they earned the money in the first place, and then you tax them again when they pass it along to their heirs.
My economics students are here. That might come up on an exam.
Okay.
So.
but I think there's another policy strategy which I'd like to recommend, and we were talking about it a little bit before this session began, which is what I call the baby bonds proposal. And essentially, it's not a bond. It's the provision of a trust fund or an endowment to every newborn infant. And the amount of that endowment, a federally provided endowment, the amount of that endowment would vary with the wealth or net worth position of the child's family. So, in my stump speech, I say if Oprah Winfrey or Bill Gates had a new child, we'd give them a $50 trust fund. But for kids who were born into families at the lowest end of the wealth distribution, we'd give them a $50,000 or $60,000 trust fund at birth, which they could access at 18 years of age, and we would guarantee a 1% real rate of interest on the account during the period where they're growing from childhood to adulthood. So this is a bit different. It's a focus on redistribution without necessarily engaging in what might be viewed as confiscatory. But the tax law, the estate tax law, is so out of whack that I think that something really does need to be done to correct that.
My last question before I open it up, here in Washington, D.C., if you were to look at younger African American males joblessness rates hover in the 30 to 40% range. And so, to the point that you made, Sandy, I'm a fan of the EITC, and I find large, robust anti-poverty effects here in the city, yet you have to have a job to benefit. So, just relatively quickly, any ideas for our jobless young men across the country?
Yeah, I just
Yeah.
offered one.
Baby bonds.
No, the federal job guarantee, that
Yeah.
the public sector would function as an employer of last resort. Any American adult who wanted to take the public sector job could do so, would be available. And I talked a bit earlier today about this being parallel to the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s and the Civilian Conservation Corps, except the difference would be that this would be a permanent option that would be universally available to all Americans. So, and I guess the other key proviso is that the job guarantee would involve the minimum compensation for any of these jobs would be at non-poverty wages.
So the idea is that you don't think these jobs are going to compete against the private sector as much by
Oh,
setting it up in this
Oh,
way?
yeah, no, they would.
yeah.
I mean, that would be one of the objectives, to force the private sector to no longer offer bad jobs.
Okay, so
Yeah,
they'll have to go
yeah.
above that floor.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, the Office of Economic Opportunity, run by Shriver in the 60s, my reading of the history is that some of this was batted around
Well, yeah.
throughout the 60s.
Oh,
Bell
it was batted around in the Clinton administration
as well. Okay,
as part of welfare reform.
okay.
The original idea in the Clinton administration was to reform welfare, but to have a jobs of last resort for moms who, once they, ran out of their temporary welfare check, would have a job if they couldn't find one in the private sector. Now, we couldn't get that through Congress,
Sure. Yeah.
but I also am old enough to remember the CETA PSE program. CETA Public Service Employment under Jimmy Carter. And we created 750,000 jobs in the in state and local governments. And it became a bit of a political football, and there were some fraud issues and other misuse of funds. And it's very hard to administer such a program, especially when it gets large. And you do have, and the unions hate this. So, because, as much as you might want private employers to have to come up to the standards of such a program, the unions will view it as undermining their power.
Well, I do think this is going to be sort of a continuous issue, unfortunately, given that we do have folks who are actively seeking work, and we do have an economic recovery, but it's one that's different than some of the previous ones. And I think that, unfortunately, it'll keep this this topic on the docket. And so, I want to pause and stop. And first of all, thank you both for your remarks. And then next, if there's audience participants who want to raise questions, please raise your hand, and I'll try to address your question, and I'll try to take time for at least 2 or 3. So first Eric, and then here in the front.
Eric Devereaux, School of I just wanted to make one comment about Sandy's work. Part and parcel of a wide range of work, a wide range of topics, and it's coming back again in the circle and saying, you know what, race really, and the attempt to say that race doesn't last 20 years has now been shown to a variety of means to be false. So people are really digging in here, have to look it right in the face. That race really matters, and in the context of that as well, that something's happened in the economic trajectory of the African American community 400 years in this country plus. It is a case that needs to be really looked at head on, whether it comes to wealth, status in the criminal justice system, employment opportunities, education, housing, health care. All of that picture says race really matters, and we've got to deal with it. At a time when many white Americans surveyed say they think that we're in a post-racial society. We have got to not let that get away from us. And this is the moment now to say, you know what, every indicator shows startling differences.
No, I agree. No, thank you for that
Let's have
comment.
something trying
Thank you. Thanks, Eric. Up front here.
I want to thank you for your presentation. It's not exactly uplifting. But to tell you the truth, I've seen it in many forms for my entire life. Now, but I just wanted, before I ask my question, if any of you can imagine this, and I'll just use this as a metaphor. By the way, to say you're 10 years old. By the way, we're an Oakland Raiders family. And you said,
You've been suffering lately.
Oakland Raiders family, and they say, well, you know, but I have to tell you, son, the Raiders haven't been to the Super Bowl in a long time. And they've had a lot of different quarterbacks, a lot of different coaches, and things just haven't worked out. And you're an Oakland Raiders family. Whereas Jimmy over there, Jim Lee's part of the New England Patriots, and they have Tom Brady, and they've been kicking ass for a long time. So just want to let you know. So what do you do to yourself besides I'm going to switch teams, or you're going to commit suicide, or you're going to try harder? You're going to try harder because you know you're at a disadvantage. Plus the word is. There you go.
I want to get to some other questions though. So
So my
yeah.
question, we had 8 years almost of an look forward to that for a long time, and believed, and I remember a lot of people that are very, very excited about that. So how do your statistics relate to the treatment versus Democratic administration? Because we reparations, I don't necessarily see those being enacted.
So, first of all, my reference point for comparison is really more in the zone of a 50-year period from the Civil Rights Act of '64. And if you look at that period of time, on most economic indicators, the relative position, not the absolute position, but the relative position of black Americans has not changed significantly. And in some respects, it's worsened, particularly if you look at something like wealth. Okay? So the differentials in wealth have actually widened since that period in time. And there's no interruption in that trajectory based upon whether you were looking at the Bush administration or the Obama administration. One of the problems, I think, with the Obama administration has been the legitimizing of narratives concerning black dysfunction as an explanation for these differences in outcomes that we observe. One of the key points of our work is to try to demonstrate that even when black folks appear to do the right thing, those kinds of disparities don't get closed. So you could think about the evidence that I presented on whites without a high school diploma having a higher level of net worth than blacks who have completed college. You can also look at unemployment rate differentials where blacks who have finished some college education have a higher unemployment rate than whites who never finished high school. So you know, that's the sense in which race matters, and I think that narrative has not been emphasized at all, even by an administration that's headed by a black president. So, you know, I think that's one of the problems, that this trajectory of inequality or disparities has been maintained, but we've gravitated more heavily towards a set of stories. We used to call this blaming the victim, right? A set of stories that suggest that the reason why those disparities exist is because of the misbehavior of black folks themselves.
let's see here. So right here in the front.
I have a question about the emergency talked about in our session before, the WPA, and Dr. Sahil, you talked about like smaller programs like school choice in New York City, addressing education, but wouldn't like a larger scale, like a federal jobs guarantee or the other programs like a WPA, like the baby bonds program, like why wouldn't that work besides the current political climate? Because the WPA in the 30s did produce tons of jobs. And so if the problem, like you said, is joblessness, then wouldn't like a emergency legislation tackle that? That the ideal that you'd like to see, or is it still going in small steps?
I had a long conversation today with the Washington editor of The Economist magazine, and we talked about what you are saying. And I told him that much as I changed my mind on the minimum wage, I have changed my mind on jobs programs. I believe there is a growing segment of the population, and especially the black males are really in trouble. A lot of them coming out of prison and can't get a job at all, following on, a period of mass incarceration. And I don't see any solution other than a sort of jobs of last resort program. Now, politically, well, we're not there yet. There is a conversation that's beginning that I've contributed to it might not be your ideal, but it's interesting that it's more politically palatable right now to link government benefits more to work. So, that's kind of what we did in welfare reform. President Clinton used to say welfare should be a way station, not a way of life. So you can have it temporarily, but eventually we expect you to work. So there's a bunch of other programs out there, SNAP, housing assistance, etc. There are some conservatives now who are talking about possibly requiring more people who are on those programs to work, but combining that or linking it with a guarantee of a job if you can't find one in the private sector. Also, these jobs don't have to be government jobs. They could be subsidized jobs in the private sector. During the ARRA, the so-called Recovery Act during the Great Depression, the states were given a big chunk of money. It was an emergency TANF fund, an emergency welfare fund. And they used a lot of that money to create jobs or to create job subsidies, and it was quite successful. And I've talked about that, and other people have talked about that. So it might come, but I think politically it has a ways to go.
Sure, and some of these policies you were discussing certainly were in effect in the 1996 welfare reform, and there were debates on whether or not time limits could be combined with some job guarantees, and so there were policy choices there made, and
Right.
and that welfare reform policy is still yet to be renewed. So, maybe we stay tuned. One more question, if there's demand. I'll go to the very back.
What do we do about income inequality for people who can't work?
Depends why they can't work full-time.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, if they're physically unable to work full-time, then of course I think we have a social obligation to provide them with support. But I'd like to underline your comment about incarceration and its effects. So there's a study that Diva Pager did in Milwaukee and in New York City where she finds in a field experiment that black men without a criminal record have a lower chance of being called back for employment than white men with a criminal record. And that's a pretty striking finding in and of itself. But then if you consider the implications for black men with a criminal record, their odds of being called back for a job are negligible. And so your point's well taken, and that's in some of the work that we've done on the job guarantee, one of the reasons we offer is to provide an employment option for returning veterans who are confronted frequently with high degrees of joblessness, but also men and women who are ex-offenders who have completed their sentences but come out into an environment in which they're unlikely to be able to get a job. Yeah.
Bill, any follow-up on that?
Well, I could talk forever, but I think it's probably getting
That's
late.
right, that's right,
I don't know if we've let enough of the audience in.
That's right, that's right. Well, I'll tell you what, it is about 9:45, and so, we'll close off the questions. And again, just want to thank both Sandy Darity and Belle Sawhill for coming out. Thank you.